Hello, students, and welcome to lecture number 8, America in the 1930s and the 1940s. We're going to be talking about the effects of the Great Depression on the oil economy, on jobs, on people in general. And this is just a brief outline of what we're going to be discussing. The Great Depression, the stock market crash of 1929. This did not only affect the United States, it affected the whole world in general. And what we had was the 1920s was very prosperous, and people were investing money. There was no such thing as insider trading, so people could not, you could tell people to invest in particular types of stocks, you see. So when we look at the stock market crash of 1929, it was kind of like everybody was becoming very spendthrift. They thought that they were going to have a lot of things that they were going to have a lot of things that were going to they thought that by spending all this money and investing all this money, they were going to be rich one day. And it didn't work out that way. And a lot of people lost their lives because they killed themselves because they lost everything. And then the United States government stepped in, and by 1932, we were headed for we were in the Great Depression, where nobody could find a job. There was, in 1934, we had what was called the Dust Bowl, and that was sandstorms that came over the Great Plains, and therefore nobody could grow anything. So they left for California looking for work. High unemployment rate. I can't guesstimate as to what it would be. Well, in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the governor of New York, former governor of New York, decides that he's going to run for president, and he wins. And in 1932, and he becomes president of the United States, and he basically tells the American people, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, and that this is going to all come out. We're going to do fine. We're going to do this. We're going to invest money. But what happens is the United States becomes somewhat of a socialist type of government because we're passing the Social Security Act. We're becoming more of a welfare state, trying to help people out, invest money in the economy. It wouldn't be until World War II until the United States just emerged from the Great Depression. We had the first New Deal, which was in the 100 days, where Franklin Roosevelt kept touting, we're going to produce a new deal for the people of the United States, and we're going to get out of this depression. And he'd have these fireside chats every week where he'd talk on the radio to people. Good propagandist, good wartime leader, but he made us more dependent on the government after the Great Depression had occurred. Huey Long, of course, the governor from Louisiana. I'm not a big fan. I thought that Louisiana paid a big price for him going to Washington, and also for him being the governor, even though he did give us free textbooks, our great-grandparents, free textbooks, and did some things for the poor. He mostly did it to enrich himself and his cronies. That's been proven, and people laugh at it all the time, but I don't think it's funny. He was corrupt, but he never got caught. Unfortunately, he was assassinated on September 8th, 1935, and never really was brought up on charges. That's a whole new different story. We're going to talk about World War II over the next two lectures. I'm going to give you a brief rundown on World War II, how it started, and Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, the roots of that laid in World War I. And there was a switch to a wartime economy where no passenger cars were produced during that particular time. There was rationing. We have been in some wars in the Middle East, for a while, and there's been no rationing because we've produced a lot of things ourselves. And then one of the biggest incidents that occurred with Executive Order 9066 after Pearl Harbor, a lot of Japanese Americans, even people who had been born here, were placed in internment camps because the United States didn't trust Japanese Americans. Later on, I believe in the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan, there was a reparations paid to the survivors of these camps because we did treat them very shabbily. But they were still survivors of the camps. And a lot of them took that money and they donated it to other causes. They didn't want the money for themselves. So we're going to be talking about that over the next couple of lectures. And we're also going to talk about a lot of these independent oil producers that kind of gave the big oil companies a run for their money And a lot of this happened in East Texas and in Oklahoma. And what we see is a great deal. They're flooding the market with all this oil, and it later becomes a problem.
Nothing could stop America's wildcatters who continued to hunt for oil across the Southwest. Many of them were running two-bit operations, scrounging for money to drill up their dreams. One of them was Columbus Joyner. People called him Dad. He was a good promoter. He knew where money could be found. He'd read the obituaries in the paper, and then he'd write florid letters to the wealthy widows of the recently departed.
Every woman has a certain place on her neck, and when I touch it, they automatically start writing me a check. Of course, the checks are not always good.
One day he wrote to the widow who owned Millwood Farm.
Miss Daisy M. Bradford, Henderson, Texas. Dear friend, do you believe that there is hidden in the bowels of the earth untold millions of oil, gas, and other minerals? One good oil well will be worth more to the citizens of your community than has all the cotton that has been raised in that community since the Civil War. My friend, now is the time to have a vision of the great possibilities that lie before you and enter wholeheartedly into the work of opening up the mineral resources of your community. Your friend, C.M. Joyner.
Dad Joyner had a partner, Doc Lloyd. Lloyd said he was a geologist, but his background always remained mysterious. Some said Doc Lloyd was a patent medicine salesman. Some said he was a veterinarian. Anyway, Lloyd drew a map of Daisy Bradford's farm and persuaded her to let them begin drilling. The first two wells Lloyd and Joyner drilled were dry holes. Joyner was so broke he often couldn't pay his men. He issued so many IOUs that they became a local currency.
Well, he was tenacious as a bulldog, of course, or he couldn't have drilled this third well. But Mr. Joyner had a way of persuasion, I'll say. And a lot of people believed in the man. And he knew that there was oil. He just knew it.
A tent city called Joynerville grew up near his third well. The road was packed with Model Ts and Model As as the curious gathered to watch and wait. A month later, the well proved to be a gusher. Dad Joyner turned out to be, after all, a true prophet. The boom that followed dwarfed all before it. The Great Depression was on, and jobs were scarce everywhere, except in East Texas.
People came in by the thousands, and they were all hungry. The story was told that if you threw a ham sandwich up in the air in the lobby of the Gregg Hotel, that 40 legs would be broken and scrambled to catch the sandwich.
J.Y. McKinnon came to East Texas 3 months after he'd heard about Dad Joyner's gusher.
Some of these wells we drilled, they called it bottom hole pay. And you'd have to drill a well and complete it and bring it in, and then you'd get your money.
Within 8 months, production was at 500,000 barrels a day. The field proved huge, 45 miles long by up to 10 miles wide.
I would go and come with those men, and a lot of times it'd be out in the field. I have put my typewriter on the hood of a car many times and typed a lease. There were many wells drilled after the first one came in. Oh, Kilgore was the richest acre on earth. It was just as close as you could get those derricks. Beautiful, because it meant money.
Everywhere people looked, and some places they didn't, they found oil. They put derricks through the marble floor of a bank, and when oil was struck under a black church, the parish closed its membership and divided up the proceeds.
The stories of large oil are like the stories of gold being found. Everyone sooner or later finds out about it. And my father was in the position that, always wanting to be in the oil business, he felt that this was a place he could make a fortune.
Jake Simmons Jr. would become a millionaire, but Dad Joyner found himself in legal trouble, having sold the same leases over and over again. He was forced to sell his rights for $1.3 million to a man he called Boy, H.L. Hunt. Dad Joyner's leases were to be the beginning of Hunt's legendary fortune. Joyner wildcatted until his death at 87, but he never struck it rich again.
Big oil fields had been discovered before in America. Big oil booms had taken place before, but there was nothing to compare with East Texas. It was like a Saudi Arabia. The scale was huge. At one point, East Texas could have supplied half of the total oil consumption in the United States. It was so big, so unusual, it became known as the Black Giant. What was so striking about it is that it had not been discovered by a major company, it had not been discovered by a geologist, but it had been discovered by these characters, Dad Joyner and Doc Lloyd. Now, the major big oil tycoons would have never paid any attention to a Dad Joyner. They would have never thought about it. They would have never seen him. And yet, what Dad Joyner did had a profound impact on the entire oil business.
So when these places would, these actual, these places would go up. I mean, when these oil wells would spew, these towns would build up around them. There were Texas, they called them boom towns. And, you know, when we see things like that occur in, you know, American history or any history for that matter, it's because people are looking for a better life, basically. And that's why a lot of these people had rushed to these places in order to get some of this new black gold that was popping up.
Thrust for the Red Line Agreement was the notion that there was going to be a shortage of oil in the United States and in the world. Thus, you had to get into these new territories. But in the middle of that arduous negotiation, by about 1925-26, the whole circumstances started to change, and one after another, major oil fields were discovered in the United States, and what had looked to be a shortage turned out to be an ever-growing surplus.
For the people of Texas and Oklahoma, oil boom towns became a way of life. Towns like Borger became little cities overnight. Fields with names like Bowlegs, Seminole, Big Lake, and Wink brought people from across the country. Those who followed from one boom town to the next were called boomers.
Oil is like any other kind of work. You think when you get into it, you'll only stay there long enough to make yourself a pile and then get out. But it don't work out that way.
Many of the oil jobs were dangerous, like handling nitroglycerin.
You don't make but one mistake handling this stuff, though. One mistake, and then if they ever find an arm or a toe, they put it in a box and bury it for you.
Some towns were company camps, little cities where the housing reflected the pecking order.
Class distinction in that camp? I don't know. It was there. You felt it. You knew it was there as children. Instead of mixing, there was this definite break according to your station in the company. You knew that Mr. So-and-so was the superintendent, and his daughter got so, you know, she wouldn't speak to you.
The men on top came from everywhere. The major companies were there, but there were plenty of independents, too.
Traditionally, independents find oil, and then majors develop the fields. And that's the way I think most of the industry has developed. But when you look in the context of the 20s, you did not have a mature American oil industry. There were major companies that were just fledglings then. But the money came in from the East, and they were able to become large companies. But the independent role is still there. We are the guys that go out and risk all. One day you can be rich, the other day you can be poor. But that's the nature of the business.
Now, with all this drilling that's going on, it's really kind of hard to tell. There's no regulations, all right, and they can't limit the amount of over drilling that they get, and we wound up seeing this overproduction of oil, and then the government had to step in because what was going on is oil was being driven down, the price was going down, so nobody was really making any money. So the government had to come in, and when they came in, they started regulating everything. But this is about overproduction. This is about how they found these little itty-bitty wells, and they were giving the big oil companies a run for their money.
The flood of the East Texas oil field soon became unmanageable.
The chaos was enormous. People were almost drilling wells on top of each other. They worked night and day. It was absolutely unregulated.
Oil was so plentiful, there was so much of it, that it got to 10 cents a barrel. Can you imagine selling a barrel of oil at 10 cents a barrel? But that's what it was.
Oil prices fell still lower to 6 cents, even 2 cents a barrel. Panic engulfed the oil-producing states. The independents were on the road to ruin. They were selling oil for much less than it cost them to produce it. The majors were also threatened.
You have to remember also at this time that the Great Depression has occurred. In the 20s, there was a growing demand for oil, but in the 30s, there's a stagnant demand. So you have the worst of all situations for the major companies, at least, the supply of oil going up and up, the demand coming down, and these major companies in particular are sitting with hundreds of millions of dollars invested on the basis of a certain price of oil, a certain stability, and both the price and the stability are shattered by East Texas.
To stop the anarchy, the governors of the major oil-producing states, Texas and Oklahoma, moved to halt production with armed force.
I walked in the bank one day, and there were just soldiers all over the place. And I wondered, what in the world? I walked on the outside and looked up and down the street, soldiers everywhere. Well, I knew that they had declared martial law.
Several thousand National Guardsmen and mounted rangers descended on the East Texas and Oklahoma oil fields. But martial law was only a temporary solution.
No policing was possible in a field where there were so many people working, so many rigs, and so much oil coming out of the ground being carted away. There was oil literally spilled on the earth, and in some places the earth was black.
In Texas, a state agency called the Railroad Commission attempted a more long-term solution. It established a system of production quotas called pro-rationing. For a short time, the market stabilized, but then prices collapsed again. The local citizens panicked. They appealed to the new president.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, President, Washington, D.C. The oil industry has completely collapsed. Stop. This great oil field totters over the abyss of ruin because of the outrageous actions of overproducers. Stop. Our properties are being drained, and we landowners are powerless to stop this damage to ourselves and to the state of Texas. Stop.
Overproduction can cause a lot of problems. And then we have this new product that comes out. It's called hot oil. And what happens is a lot of these independent drillers, They take the oil, put it in barrels, and bury it because they didn't want the government to know that they were sneaking it out in order to sell it. And so the government comes forth and they bring a gentleman into this particular plan because remember, it's going through the Great Depression and it's illegal to sell this oil, okay? Without the government seeing it first.
In Washington, President Roosevelt recognized what he called the wretched conditions in the oil business. He made his Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, oil administrator and told him to solve the crisis.
Harold Ickes was a self-styled curmudgeon. He was difficult, he was suspicious, he had his own wiretapping instruments within his own investigative service within the Interior Department that made sure that people were loyal to him. There's a story that he got annoyed with people coming in to work a little late, so he directed the police of the Interior Department to lock the doors of the Interior Building at exactly 9 o'clock. And then he waited for 10 minutes and opened the doors and took names himself, personally, of everybody who came in the door after 9. Suffice it to say, they started coming in on time.
Ickes plain disliked big businessmen. He called them barbarians in dress suits. But he saw oil as a vital national resource.
We have passed from the Stone Age to bronze to iron to the Industrial Age and now to an age of oil. Without oil, American civilization as we know it could not exist.
In East Texas, Ickes investigators found that pro-rationing quotas were hated.
Many people thought that the law was not valid, that they owned the lease, they owned the oil, they could produce as much of it as they liked. And they started running oil in excess of the amount allowed by the law. That was known as hot oil.
The oil was put into barrels, covered by weeds, stored during the day, and then at night transported across state boundaries. There was always graft and money handed over from one person to another to get that oil out of state and to get it into production. It was very lucrative for the people who were running it.
Today, Walter C. Teagle, president of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, came to see me by appointment. His company is the largest producing company in the oil field. His proposal is that the government make an oil reserve out of the East Texas oil field. He said this is the way and the only way to control the production of hot oil. It seemed rather a startling proposition to come from the president of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey.
Boss Teagle had, once again, discovered the limits of corporate power. This time it wasn't Calouste Gulbenkian, but the black giant itself that threatened to overwhelm Standard Oil and all the other producers. To put the industry back on course, the federal and state governments worked out a system of quotas and regulations. 30 years later, the founders of OPEC would look to that system as their model. But in the short term, a new law that curbed the flow of bootleg oil was to restore order in the oil fields.
The days of hot oil are over. The law shall be supreme.
In some ways, East Texas can be seen as the last hurrah for the old-fashioned independence. It's the last time that unregulated production is allowed in a major field in the United States. It's the last time that oil is produced in a frenzy in which whoever has the rights to the oil underneath the surface is allowed to pump it out as fast as they would like.
The great irony for the oil industry was that the key issue facing it had turned around 180 degrees. The 1920s had begun with the specter of shortage, and that had shaped the strategies of companies and the strategies of governments. By the late 1920s and the middle of the 1930s, the problem was surplus, too much oil, and that became the central concern, the central obsession, both of oil companies and of national governments when they focused on oil.
Now, what had been going on the whole time is that the government started to regulate this. And when they regulated it, they basically, very few people had cars because they couldn't afford it because it was the Great Depression. They were losing their jobs. They couldn't pay for it. And there were, a car was considered a symbol of prosperity. Well, the price of oil kind of levels off. The price of gas kind of levels off. And you have these, you got to excuse my cat, my wife's cat. She likes to get in on the picture every once in a while. And so we see what cars are used for in the Great Depression. They're used to get from one place to another, just like they are today. But during the Great Depression, it meant a little bit more.
Oil had touched the lives of all Americans, no matter how poor. The victims of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl now traveled by automobile. The words of Oil Administrator Harold Ickes echo across the drought-stricken American landscape.
We have passed from the Stone Age to bronze to iron to the Industrial Age and now to an age of oil. Without oil, American civilization as we know it could not exist.
American industry provided, oil industry provided 6 to 7 billion barrels of oil for the Allies. Harold Ickes became the oil czar. And then during World War II, we had to do what was called oil rationing, gasoline rationing, which means that you had a sticker on your window. And it said like you had an A sticker. You could only get gas on Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. And those are the only days you could get it. If you had a B sticker, you go on Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday, okay, and different things. There was also meat rationing, too, for the war effort. All this overproduction didn't really spell out a lot in the beginning of the war. The United States was not doing well in the beginning of the war, and we're going to cover that a little bit later. But technology also made it necessary to provide high-octane fuels for aircraft, so that they could fly longer distances, okay? Also, it increased technology as far as bombs and things like that are concerned. Well, in order to get the oil from the oil fields to where they needed to go, there had to be some sort of way to transport that oil to different depots along the East Coast to get to Europe in order to help the Allies win the war.
To achieve victory, America would be called upon to supply 6 out of the 7 billion barrels of oil used by the Allies. U.S. oil czar Harold Ickes was confident he could deliver. His first step was to get the oil from Texas to the Northeast. The Big Inch was born.
It's the last mile for the Big Inch. To the eastern states, the world's largest oil pipeline, built in just 1 year, will carry a 1,500-mile river of oil from Texas fields at the rate of 300,000 barrels a day. The sponsor of the $95 million Dream Pipe, fuel chief Harold Ickes, promises more gas for the East, but not for non-essential driving. Big job of the pipeline is to supply the armed services with fuel for attack.
There were a lot of places to find the oil. Mexico. In the 1917 Constitution, subsoil belonged to the state. The oil industry was nationalized under Lázaro Cárdenas. The name of the company was called Pemex. And Saudi Arabia, from the 1920s to the 1940s, the oil possibilities became known that they had these rich deposits. And they were going to dictate what was going to happen with that oil and which side was going to get that oil. Of course, if you pay for it, you get it. Money talks, BS walks. And that's how the oil-producing nations started doing things. So this will conclude Lecture 8 on world oil history. We're going to cover World War II, the origins of World War II, and how oil played an important part in it, because we have to talk about the Nazi supply of oil. There was an oil field in Ploesti, Poland, that the Germans relied heavily upon. And so I'm just going to go and leave it here. I will put this PowerPoint up so you can look at it. Probably do it in a PDF version because the videos are included in here. But you'll have access to the lecture as well. So I will see you next time.